Hey everybody, and welcome to the EV Cafe Takeaway, a podcast focused on that zero-emission future that we all hope for, he says, remembering his script as he goes along. Every week I get joined by one of the wonderful team from the EV Cafe, and today, no exception, I have the lovely John Curtis. Welcome, John.
Well, bless you, and lovely to see you yet again for another wonderful podcast.
I don't know what you mean, but anyway. The most important bit, of course, is the guest. And every week we get joined by innovators, pioneers and collaborators. But very, very rarely do we get joined by such esteemed company that has contributed to major reports that are globally affecting through government and all that sort of good stuff. And we have the lovely Richard Allan.
Hello.
Professor Richard Allan.
Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, Richard, I have high hopes for you because, of course, we know your lovely wife, Liz, who has another podcast, which I know that you've performed on more than once. So, the bar is right up there, my friend.
Yeah, I've done podcasts. We had technical difficulties with that as well. So the electric evolution, but so that was all preparation for this, though.
Well, I would say the only way is up, but that would be rude to your lovely wife. I don't mean it at all. She does a great job, and actually, I think is a few episodes ahead of us in terms of total output. But we're not comparing at all. Anyway, Richard, tell us a little bit about your rise to fame. So tell us what you do. You're a professor. What are you a professor of? And what is this IPCC thing that you contributed to that we are going to investigate and unpack a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of climate science at the University of Reading. So, I mean, that basically involves, teaching, so lecturing on various aspects of climate change and hydrology and other things to undergraduate students, master's students, PhD students, bringing them through projects and stuff like that. But it's also about doing research. So, I always wanted to do research in terms of climate because I was interested in climate change. And that involves, analysing tons of data, satellite data, observations taken around the world, understanding how climate is changing, but then also using complex simulations and trying to use this to understand the world better and to try and make better predictions of what's going to happen in the future. So the other thing that we do at university, we're expected to do at least, is, we're part of the community. So, we have to, well, we don't have to, but, I do outreach at schools, local interest groups, things like this, which is, I think, absolutely crucial. It's really important to kind of not stay in your ivory towers, as they say, and get out and talk to people, real people, not academics, and so on and so forth, and talk about the climate to a range of different people. And it also includes doing media stuff. The university likes that kind of thing because you're talking about the university, but from a personal point of view, you're talking to a very wide audience about climate change, which is absolutely important to get the message across to a wide audience. And, for example, the highest point for me in that area was, having to travel up to Manchester and go on to BBC Breakfast and talk to the legendary Susanna Reid and the late Bill Turnbull. So, that I was absolutely petrified doing that. It was, I hate doing things like that, but I know it's important. So, I did it, and slightly perturbed beforehand when the makeup artist came along and started dabbing stuff on my forehead, saying, no, it's still too shiny. It's still too shiny. But,
tell me about it.
so these are the kind of the kind of areas that I do. But one of the most important things, I think, personally, that I feel I've done is to be part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, like you mentioned earlier. So this was actually set up in the late 1980s by the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization to assess the state of the art of climate change. How has climate changed in the past? How is it changing now? What's the future going to hold? And what will that mean for us? And how can we avoid a terrible future of extreme climate change. So I was involved in early on just as a contributing author, doing bits, providing bits of knowledge, bits of assessment of certain areas, and more recently I was involved in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which the first one came out in 2021, which was a huge undertaking. You don't get paid for it. You're expected to do this extra work, which is a huge amount of work to do, and get this huge assessment report, and then crucially agree the summary for policymakers with the governments from around the government representatives from around the world. So that was what I would see as a really important part of what I feel I've done.
Yeah, no, and so what else you have done is just broken mine and John's heart, and I'll tell you how, because I was waiting for one of the most exciting and important things that I've done is go on to the EV Cafe in Birmingham and come and talk to a wonderful group of people. But this is where we came across you, wasn't it, Richard? The one of our partner days, where you were kind enough to do some of this outreach to, to us basically, and all of our partners. And I can be absolutely truthful in saying that you managed to really blow us all away with your level of knowledge and your level of understanding. We were talking about this on another podcast with someone else that hasn't come out yet, but we were talking about how you articulate your subject. And as an academic, it's easy to talk up here somewhere for us mere mortals that don't understand. But you managed to articulate this whole challenge of climate and the science and the meteorology behind it in the words of a 6-year-old, which is what Einstein said. If you know your subject really, really well, then you'll be able to articulate it in that. And you've done that for us, and that's why we're talking to you today. John, I know that you wanted to follow up, or am I going to carry on?
No,
he's looking at me blankly.
No, I desperately do. Richard, I'm fascinated to understand how you got into all of this. Well, climate science way back when wasn't the talking subject that it is now. People didn't know, weren't interested, but you somehow grabbed hold of this subject matter. Why was that?
Yeah, so I guess in the first place, I was born in Birmingham, not too far from that legendary EV Cafe Partners Day, which obviously was the highlight. I did actually write that down. Yeah, doing that was incredible for me as well, because again, I was incredibly nervous, but the feedback I got from you guys, from people there, it astonished me. I think one of the secrets is of not being too clever. If you're too clever, like you say, these too clever academics, they don't understand how people can not know what they're saying. So luckily, I'm not too clever. That's one of my special skills. But I mean, yeah. So I was born in Birmingham, and we moved down to St Albans, and I think my parents had this A to Z of Birmingham, and I was absolutely fascinated with it. These maps, this spaghetti junction, and things like this. And I guess I got interested in maps and roads and that kind of thing. So not a million miles away from your areas of specialties in terms of networks and that kind of thing. And that kind of led on then to weather maps in some way, because I mean, like we're possibly getting Saturday night. There's a load of snow coming up. It'll turn back to rain down south, but. As a child, I was fascinated by snow. I was excited. Is it going to snow? And I was always terribly disappointed when the weather people promised snow and it never came. And so I wanted to understand, well, why do sometimes they get it right? Why do they sometimes get it wrong? And so I got into weather maps and things like that. My dad brought back some weather maps from what was then the London Weather Centre. I don't think it exists now, and I was fascinated by these cold fronts and these warm fronts and isobars and things like that. So I kind of got into weather and climate like that. But like you said, John, I mean, in the 1980s, there was less talk really about climate change. But I I learnt about weather, but also I learnt about the fact it was 20,000 years ago. It was much colder. That we were in the midst of a glacial period. There were ice sheets moving across northern Britain, a completely different climate. So I was interested in why that was the case. But back in the 1980s, there was more talk perhaps about nuclear war. I mean, I remember being terrified by at the age of 11 watching, I don't know if you've seen it, Threads. It's about a nuclear war playing out in Sheffield. The most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. Absolutely petrifying. I mean, what my parents were doing, showing me something like this at the age of 11, and my brother at age 8, I don't know. But anyway, I think that kind of instilled in me, something about the world around us and the reality of what we're living in. And at the time, there were things like acid rain, which you don't hear about now, because things were actually more polluted. There were less regulations in Europe, in North America in the 70s, and there was more pollution. The air quality was even worse in some regions because of industry, heavy industry, things like that. So that was talked about. But actually things cleaned up during the 1980s. But what was also beginning to be mentioned was the greenhouse effect. There were people like Jim Hansen who recognised things early on. This was recognised long before the fact that the planet was warming up, maybe in the earlier 1900s by calendar. Measurements of carbon dioxide were being taken, and year on year they were going up. It was known by the fossil fuel industry decades and decades ago that this could be a big issue. But in the 1980s, that was when it started being mentioned in the political sphere, I think. So it started being mentioned, and I became interested in the greenhouse effect. How does that work? Why do these trace gases in the atmosphere have such a big effect? Why do they punch so far above their weight in keeping the world warmer than it otherwise would be, keeping the planet habitable? But the fact is, we were increasing the level of carbon dioxide, which is now over 50% higher than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that is making this greenhouse effect stronger. It's causing the planet the efficiency at which the planet can lose heat to space is diminishing year on year because of these rising greenhouse gases. And so I thought, this is fascinating. So I learned about that. I learned about the ozone hole, which was a big thing at the time as well. It had been discovered by scientists looking at satellite data and other data and showing these things. And I thought, well, this is something that, perhaps I can, I find it fascinating, but, perhaps it's something useful to do. So I got into it in that way. So I realised I needed to study maths, physics, those kind of things. I mean, I was really interested in geography, but actually you need maths and physics to be able to, churn out, crunch the numbers and make, understand and use big data, run simulations and that kind of thing. So, I studied them. I went to study environmental sciences at UEA in Norwich. And then I went on to do a PhD in Reading. In the meteorology department, and after that I got a job at the Met Office, so who does all our weather, not to be confused by the police in London, but the Met Office was in Bracknell in those days, so I worked in Bracknell, and then came back and got a postdoc at Reading, and then a lectureship, and then got to where I was today, really. So went on to get my professorship eventually, and then ended up working on the IPCC.
Wow. Fantastic. I mean, that's been some journey, hasn't it? And so I wasn't stupid at school. I was all right. I was okay. That came later. And so, but there are people that are clever. Sometimes it's, I don't know. When did you realise you were clever? When did you realise that you had this this gift of academicness?
Well, yeah, I've never considered myself that clever, but I think I was always pretty good at school, and you risk being labelled geeky and you're into your maths, you get high marks. But luckily for me, I was on the football team, so that gave me a few kudos points and things like that. So I wasn't terribly at the bottom, but it was a normal school. It was a comprehensive, and there were challenging classes. A lot. We were interviewing a few years ago. We interviewed a guy who was coming up to do a postdoc with us, and he came from France. And we noticed on his CV, he worked as a teacher, and then he came into science. And we asked him, so why did you change tax? Why have you come into research? And he said, he was French. Excuse my terrible accent. I was not a teacher. I was a police officer, and that's always a big challenge at school. But I think I realised I was okay. My dad was also an academic. He came from quite a poor family, but he was the first to go to university, and he did very well. And I was privileged to be in a more comfortable household. My dad was an academic, so like a lot of academics, they think they're clever, but really most of them are just very privileged, and they've got there because of the luck of where they're born, what kind of life they've led. So that's kind of I've never considered myself massively clever, but I kind of like to think I'm reasonably I can apply myself, and I've got some skills.
I think it's fair to say, Richard, you're probably in the top 1%, because not everybody becomes a professor, right? That's it. But you did miss a wonderful opportunity there, I have to say, in that your French friend should have been an officer of the law. According to the Mr. What's his name?
Clouseau, wasn't it?
Was it? Oh, Inspector Clouseau. That's it. Yeah. That's it. Anyway.
I thought you were referring to Officer Crabtree from Hello. Good morning.
As you can see, we can only take so much academic before we have to descend into children again. But so, Richard, in all of this, you're staring down the barrel on a daily basis of an impending disaster. And you're probably closer to the knowledge of that than most of us, really. How do you square that? How do you work with that within yourself? Because life has been good and to you. We'd like to hear more about how you got to what you do in Reading, what you do when you're not kind of looking at climate science, but. I mean, there must have been some challenging times in your life which have given you the ability to kind of tackle this difficult subject, and given you the passion to keep it alive for people to understand. Talk me through how that is.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, you only have to watch the news every day to realise, none of us have had very challenging lives. It's all relative. But, I think... it was, like I mentioned earlier, it was kind of instilled into me early on. I used to go on, my parents dragged me on CND marches, against nuclear weapons and things like that. So, but there was always a big environmental kind of aspect. It was always, we talked about how important the environment was. And I think, perhaps, as well as my dad and my uncle, perhaps of getting me into weather and kind of into the that kind of academic aspect. One guy who really influenced me was perhaps my grandfather, Tom Allan, who he was an interesting character. I mean, he ran off to sea when he was 16. He witnessed he was like the lowest of the low cabin boy. He witnessed his friend, the other lowest of the low, Tongan. A guy who did all the dog's body stuff, fall from the mast and die in front of him. He saw the world. He witnessed racism firsthand from his fellow shipmates, and that always instilled in him a sense of society and a sense of fairness and equity, I think. And he kind of, he worked as a roofer, he worked as a caretaker, lots of different jobs, but he never was given the opportunity to be academic, but he learned stuff. He kind of realised the power of learning. I think he instilled that in his children. My dad, for example, who went on to become an academic. And I think, listening to him talk about his stories about, the environment and how important it was, how we're damaging it, I think was really, really important to me as a young child. And that kind of instilled in me the importance of it. And then kind of squaring what you were kind of saying, squaring what I'm doing with what is actually happening out there. I suppose I do find it difficult, like a lot of people, to, here are the numbers, these are what they say, this is the outcome, square that with actually what is happening. And I think that's going back full circle to kind of at the beginning where I talked about that programme Threads about a nuclear war that was playing out in Sheffield. That terrified me because it was so real. It put into me what this could mean for me if a nuclear war happened. And in the same way, it's difficult sometimes to put what will this mean when sea levels rise by a metre, when the intensity of rainfall goes up by 10 or 15 more percent, when droughts become more crippling, when heat waves become more crippling. What will this mean when some societies can't actually cope with the damage this is wreaking on them? How will that affect global governance? How will that affect how society develops? So these kind of things are also terrifying, but it needs something to put this in everyone's heads, what this could mean and how important it is. So I still struggle, from crunching the numbers to thinking what this will actually mean for my family and for my friends and for our society.
But we'll all be dead, Richard. The reality is, here I sit I'm of a certain age where I've started to think I've got maybe 15 years of my life left, maybe 20 if I'm lucky. I can't arrest the change in my 20 years. Much as I try, and we do try. Do you ever get that sense of just, why am I doing this? Because let's be honest, lots of people aren't listening. Lots of people don't want to hear it. If they do hear it, they dismiss it out of hand and don't get access to experts like you who turn it into something which is understandable, and not only understandable, but you give us a sense that we can do something about it. Do you never just think, I'm going to be dead in 20, 30, 40 years' time. It's not my problem?
No, I mean, although my wife Liz will say that, I'm a very much a glass half empty kind of guy in small things. I'm perhaps a bit more optimistic in terms of, how things are going and what we're going to be capable of doing, presuming we don't all degrade into populist governments and that are not collaborating together and working against each other. I kind of see that we have made a lot of progress, and a lot of that progress has actually been driven by people, by smaller groups like your communities, like yourselves in business. Business is driving through a lot of change very rapidly, faster than from the political cycle, which of course is inhibited by the fact it needs to balance good policy with making sure they're going to get voted in the next election. It's a terrible line to tread, I think. It's a very difficult line to tread. But, companies, University of Reading, for example, is doing a hell of a lot to reduce its carbon emissions. It's won various sustainability awards. So I think there's a lot of progress being made. So I do see some, although there are some, there are dire predictions of what's going to happen, I do see massive amounts of progress being made. And so I am slightly optimistic that we can overcome this, and it may not be a perfect future world, but it will be hugely, hugely better than the one that we're avoiding by cutting greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide.
Because it's one of those things which is really key to what we do, but inevitably, Paul and I, at times, you think transport is but one part of this whole emissions issue. The UK is a very small part of the global footprint. And that you do get to the point where you think, this problem is so big, and I know I'm making a difference in my community. I know I'm making a difference in my home. I know I'm making a difference with my family and possibly the people that I know. But climate change is inevitable. You mentioned the Ice Age 20,000 years ago. Over a span of time, climate does change, and I recognise that climate is changing faster now than it ever has. But it's inevitable. We can only influence certain things. And there's a mass of activity that needs to change for us to arrest the direction of travel that we have in this area. How can we square this circle? How can we, at pace and scale, get change adopted? Paul and I were talking about vans this morning, electric vans, and that businesses aren't buying them in the volumes that they're needed. You extrapolate that out to cover other areas of huge emissions. We've got a massive task on our hands.
Yeah, and things are happening bit by bit, but not quickly enough to where we want to be. But the crucial thing to remember is that every bit of warming matters. Every half a degree of extra warming is going to make the damage from climate change worse and far worse. It can get to a point where tipping points occur and things can spiral in some regions. So every bit of warming avoided matters. Even if we're not going to be able to get to exactly where we want to be to avoid seriously dangerous climate change, every bit of warming that is avoided by the actions we take now and we have been taking is important. You mentioned, of course, it's not just about one sector, it's across all sectors, transport, industry, domestic buildings. But these things can be segmented and compartmentalised, and policies made tailored to each one. I think, there are governments that are, including our own at the moment, I think is doing a lot. But on the other hand, there's, like you say, a huge amount of misinformation going on as well. From my perspective, and talking about having to go on the media, well outside my comfort zone, I've experienced things actually improving because, when I first started doing this, you'd go on the BBC and you'd be put up against some kind of crank oil funded person who would spout complete crap, and that was on the BBC. They had this false balance. That we need someone to balance this scientist, even though almost every single scientist in the relevant field knows that climate change is a problem. I had to, at one point, there was a guy, I don't know if you remember him, Christopher Monckton. So he was actually part of Thatcher's government, and for all her faults, Thatcher actually did get climate change, and she set up the Hadley Centre for Climate Prediction and Research, which I later worked for about 5 years. But as part of her government, there was this Lord Monckton, who was obviously on board at the time, but then he became this massive climate skeptic, and it was almost his role to go out and push out this disinformation. And one time I ended up doing outreach at a school in West Berkshire. It was an environment day, and what I didn't realise, one of the other special guests was Lord Monckton, who basically his job there was to completely rubbish and undermine everything I said, which for a young scientist like I was then was quite horrifying. It made me question my own credibility. But on the other hand, I learnt quite a lot from this guy, because although he was spouting rubbish and misinformation, he did it in an incredibly engaging way. And I thought, well, this is quite powerful. So yeah, you've got to be engaging, but you've also got to, you can't talk at people. You've got to listen. You've got to listen to what people say, and everyone's got different situations, different lives. Like going to what you were mentioning, you were talking about earlier with the van thing. It's not just about, let's just do it, because every business has its own pushes and pulls and things like that. So you can't just literally do things, and that immediately it's all in the context. And this goes as well for domestic stuff. I mean, one of the most proud things I'm proud of, apart from the IPCC, I think, is the fact that through being married to Liz Allan and what she's doing in the EV sector, we decided, right, we're going to go and decarbonise our home. It's not just about transport; it's about the whole thing. So, I previously cut out meat from my diet. That's exceedingly important. Agriculture is a massive problem, particularly methane emissions from ruminants like cows and sheep. So cut out that. I cut out flying. I, as a scientist, I need to fly occasionally for the IPCC, but I've tried to cut out flying completely where I can. I go by train across Western Europe. So it's part of the excitement, the journey, these kind of things. But then domestically, we decided, right, we're going to we can just about afford to get solar panels. We get solar panels, battery, EV charger. We were EV ready. Then we got our second-hand EV. We traded in our old Volkswagen. Didn't hardly have to pay any difference for a second-hand Hyundai. We did that, and then most recently we stopped using gas. We got a heat pump. It was -6 degrees Celsius out here this morning. The heat pump was using quite a bit of electricity, I have to say, but it was working top notch. The house was warm. So personally, you can do a lot, and sometimes it's a matter of we can't do this. Heat pumps are too expensive. They don't work in cold weather. EVs, I'm not going to be able to afford them. All this stuff you can get over these, but it's about getting the message out there, like you guys are doing so well. The 5 of you, and that's it. It's getting the message out there. It's having community groups. It's about talking to your friends and engaging with people that maybe don't agree with you. So it's a huge problem. I can't deny it. But we are making, and you are making progress. So.
Well, this is something that I noticed in doing my research. We occasionally do a little bit of research, despite being very unacademic, I have to say. But I did happen to notice that you're a big Twitter. Well, no, it's not Twitter anymore. I'm still calling it Twitter. It's X now, isn't it? I mean, that snappily named. What was he thinking? Anyway, X, and you have over 5,000 followers on Twitter, X, and you obviously do a lot of outreach there. I mean, is that a place where you're going out into the beyond the church, in effect? Getting out into the big wide world, because Twitter can be a pretty angry place at times.
Yeah, I dabble with social media. I mean, it's actually Liz that got me into it in the first place. So, and yeah, Twitter is a bit of a mess now. So I've moved over to Blue Sky. So a lot of academic people have moved over to Blue Sky. That's the place where everyone's going. I suggest you do the same.
We're there.
You get a decent conversation, but going back to what we were discussing before, you also need to engage with the people that don't agree with you as well. And yeah, it can be a bit difficult, but because I don't really have a very big following. I mean, there are people at University of Reading like Ed Hawkins, for example, the inventor of the climate stripes and the climate spiral. He has huge numbers of followers. He engages brilliantly because it's about a conversation. My brain doesn't work in that way. I hate talking to people, really, and I hate engaging with people. I like sat in a room kind of doing a bit of number crunching, but I do it because I know it's useful. But someone like Ed Hawkins, Hannah Cloak at work, they do a huge amount of engagement, and we're a family. We all do things. We all have special skills. We all come together, and that's the best way to do it, isn't it? You're a family, you have your different skills, and you get on with it together, and all push yourself out of your comfort zone, but you need different people doing different things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I one of your posts taught me something, because I was watching it was all the food CO2 from food, different food types, and this little graph was going up, and I was like, oh my gosh, eggs are quite, they're quite bad. But then I saw the graph continue and sort of do this, for those that I'm showing that something goes up. And of course, beef. Wow. I know, yeah, sorry. It doesn't work visually, does it?
This was food and how much carbon dioxide emissions or equivalent carbon dioxide, so that includes other greenhouse gases, per 100 grams of the food. So for some things that doesn't work, like chocolate. You don't eat the same amount of chocolate. Well, maybe some people do the same amount of chocolate as you would big beefsteak, but beef is by far the worst because cows burp out methane. Sheep do as well. It's a huge. Methane is much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it's worth looking through that list of what things are bad. Industrially farmed fish and seafood is terrible as well. Even plant-based stuff, if it's flown in because it's perishable, that's bad, and that's why we need better labelling of stuff. Red, amber, green. Maybe what is terrible, what is okay, and what is good to eat. We've got to all change our diet. We don't need to eat as much protein as perhaps we were led to believe. Plant-based stuff is actually good. And the other horrifying thing that I kind of shared in that post was, if you add up all the animals that we rear to be slaughtered, the total mass, the total weight of them is 15 times larger than all the other wild mammals on the planet. So, I mean,
that's bonkers.
15 times. 15 times. There's a square showing all the large mammals on the planet. Humans are a very large part, actually. There's many billions of us, 8 billion or so. But the animals we rear to eat massively more than that. And they dwarf the natural mammals so utterly dismally. I mean, that's the other side of it. It's not just about climate. It's about valuing our natural capital. We haven't valued the soils. The soils are degrading because of industrial scale farming. So we need to move agriculture on to be more sustainable. And in a similar way, the diets aren't sustainable. So it's not just about transport, of which, that is still a huge problem. It's 23% or so of global greenhouse gas emissions, a massive problem. Most of that is road transport. So all these bits are kind of equally important. We need to consider all areas of greenhouse gas emissions and deal with them all, but they can be dealt with separately with different policies.
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard to deal with these hard facts that I don't know, it kind of, on the one hand, it makes us feel like we've got no choice, like we must do something, which in reality we must. But some of those things are things that we don't want to do. I like a steak, but actually I don't like it that much that I wouldn't miss it, if I'm honest. Always gets stuck in my teeth and just gets irritating. Anyway. But so maybe I'll sacrifice steak.
and it's not a matter of everyone has to never eat, only have a plant-based diet. I mean, I mostly do, but that's a choice. But because we don't really value things properly, the whole cost of eating that steak isn't included in the price because of industrial scale agriculture that's degraded the soils and so forth, but also because we're not accounting for the greenhouse gas emissions and the damage that does. So therefore things are too cheap, and we think, well, that's fine, I'll buy that, I'll have that every few days. But just having it as a luxury is still fine, I guess.
Richard, do us a favour. Tell us, what is the thing in your life professionally that you have achieved that you are most proud of?
I suppose it'd have to come back to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because that's where I've had to really work harder perhaps than I have before, and for the most important kind of goal, I think. And at the time I was acting as joint head of department as well. So I was doing this and the IPCC. I don't think I was doing the the department job very well. It's not one of my best skills, but I kind of did it anyway. But then I was doing the IPCC, and it was not only the monumental challenge of assessing all of the literature that we had to in our chapter, which was looking at the global water cycle, rainfall, snowfall, droughts, flooding, things like that, changing hydrology. That was a monumental task in assessing and how we come up with the state of the art. But actually, it was also about different people coming together with different ideas. And we were a new chapter, and we had different characters in our group, different perspectives, lots from the global south, because the IPCC was trying to balance, males, females, people from different countries, from the global south as well as the global north. And that created huge issues in terms of how we work together, and huge friction, because, there were perceptions of, so you're not listening to me because perhaps I can't, English isn't my native language, or because I'm a woman, you're not listening to me as you should be. And all these unconscious biases that we all have. And if you think you haven't got unconscious biases, you've definitely got a massive unconscious bias, because we all have unconscious biases, and we all need to think every day about, am I judging this because of my biases?
Yeah. So
in that group, there was conflict, there was difficulties, and for me, at the end, the lead scientist in that group had to step back because of mental health issues. Things were so severe in that process of having to do your day job, having to resolve conflicts, having to do this monumental challenge of assessing all the climate change literature. He had to step back, and that gave me an opportunity to perhaps step forward more. And I ended up helping to write the summary for policymakers with a bunch of other absolutely amazing scientists. I met some, these were really clever, amazing people. And writing this report, but then one of the crucial things I think I alluded to earlier on was the fact that we had to agree this report with basically 53 countries from around the world. Their delegates had to agree line by line every part of this report. So there's a balance between science. We couldn't say stuff that was wrong. It had to be based on our report, but also the needs of different countries and their different perspectives and their different priorities. And so some things they didn't agree with, and they said, we don't think you can say it like this. We want you to say it like this. And there was discussions going on. There were arguments in the background on our Slack channel saying, no, stop saying that, no. In terms of agreeing what we were saying in this report. But then, and it was incredibly stressful. I had to delay various holidays. Like I was going for a walking trip with my son. I had to delay that. Because this was all still in the post-COVID stuff where we're having to do stuff online still. And then we came out with this report. I was most proud of that because this, fortuitously or not, came out just before the Glasgow COP. So when our country was hosting the convention of the parties, the big climate meeting that we followed on from previous ones like the Paris climate meeting and the most recent one in Azerbaijan. So this summary for policymakers was absolutely an important document in this COP meeting, which was determining how we progress with climate change, and really important issues in terms of what perhaps doesn't get discussed is equity. So not just equity within countries, but across countries. I talked about the global south and the global north. Countries that have emitted very little in the way of greenhouse gases compared to the UK, USA, but were suffering most of the damage because they were more vulnerable to the impacts from climate change. So how do you deal with that? There has to be climate finance. So there has to be richer nations have to actually finance poorer nations or nations that are getting damaged more to make that transition. So, for example, there were trilateral agreements with South Africa, for example, with a bunch of different other countries to help that transition by moving money from rich to less rich countries to help with that transition. It's in all our interests. And the other thing is the loss and damage issue, which is what I mentioned. Some people, some countries are being much more affected by the impacts from climate change because they're less able to adapt to it. They're less able to protect themselves. So there needs to be money moved to, they don't like to call it compensate, but to distribute that wealth more equitably, such that some of this wealth from the global north is going to the global south to help with the problems of climate change. So all these things, I felt I was feeding into this really important process. So that's what made me most proud of what I've done. It was painful, but it was worth it.
Absolutely.
It makes my vans feel quite small.
Well, small vans.
It's huge. It's huge, though, isn't it? What you've achieved there, Richard, and I love the fact that it is in such safe hands with your willingness to communicate in a way that most of us could understand. And if I could understand it, then most people can. So we have a sort of closing tradition on the podcast, which is before you can see a magic wand. Now, as it was 3D printed, I don't think it's got quite the power of Harry Potter's, but it is our magic wand, and we are going to hand it to you metaphorically. There you go. It's being handed through the camera. There you go. You got it. See's magic has changed. Hang on. Turn him into a frog. Turn him into a frog. Turn him into a frog.
Ribbit.
Oh, it doesn't work.
Needs to be in Latin.
Oh, that's it. Yes. No, I'm not even going to try. Richard, what would you like to do with? You've got a wish. You can wave your magic wand, and whatever it is will happen. What would you change? What would you do?
Yeah, obviously a very difficult one. Well, I suppose going back to kind of what we were discussing earlier on, I would like to magically make the full value of things really appear to people, so that rather than just buying your cheap chicken at the supermarket or your polluting antiquated ICE vehicles at a certain price, the full cost of what that combustion engine vehicle or what eating that food does to the soils, to the air we breathe, to the climate is properly and equitably included, so that we all know when we're buying things, when we're making choices, so that we can make better choices. I think that would, it's a bit of a messy magic wand,
No,
clearly,
I love it.
World peace, etc., is much simpler, but that's maybe perhaps a more tangible and something a bit more close to what could possibly be done. The magic wands are only good to so far, I'd say.
Yeah, I love that, because we talk often about the total cost of ownership. So we talk about it in the context of vehicles, and people say, "Oh, the cost of the vehicle is so high," but actually the cost of using that vehicle over a period of time, with the cost of energy and all of that kind of stuff being compensatory, and the lesser service and maintenance and repair, and we talk about that. But I love that idea of kind of waving that magical wand and going, it's no longer £4.59 for your large chicken at Tesco or Sainsbury, or I can't name them all, others are available, and it turns into £11.73 or whatever it might be, because that is the cost to the world of that single chicken. There's an extra 150%. I think that's genius, and I love it. Have you done that for any single product?
I haven't personally, but I mean, there are scientific papers done on the full cost of different foodstuffs and things like that, and economists would tell me, "Oh, you're very naive, Richard. We this is already done through subsidies and taxes and things." Taxes and things like that. So it's already being done to a certain extent, but it's not being done well enough. And the full cost of things like I mean, back in the 1980s or 1990s, when I was learning stuff about the environment at UEA, there was things called natural capital. That's still a thing. You know, the soil is a natural capital. We've just been taking stuff out of it and thinking it's unlimited. You know, it'll always give us, you know, growth, but you know, we're removing all the nutrients out of it, and we're not properly accounting for that because its value hasn't been accounted for properly. And the same with, you know, in your sector, the full cost of, you know, polluting in terms of people's health and what they're breathing in terms of the damage to low-lying nations that are going to get swamped by sea level rise and things like that. It's not properly accounted for, and it's very difficult to do that. But we just need more information so that we can make better decisions, I think.
I love it though. I love it. I think that could be up in the top 4 or 5. I can't think of all of the wishes, but that was very good use, Richard. Very good use indeed. That's going to get me thinking for some time now. I mean, we can do it for vehicles, but I'd love to understand, you know, take a piece of the cost of the multiple billions that the NHS are spending on air quality related health issues. You know, the numbers of people that die as a result of air quality related health issues. How much... Lots of things, right? So many things. That's got me really thinking. I love it. I love it. Anyway, that's all we got time for, folks. John, final thoughts?
Do you know what my final thoughts are? Every time I listen to Professor Richard Allan, I come away with something new. This man was born to educate. I honestly can't tell you how much I value the things you say. I know that it causes you some anxiety when you communicate to a large audience. My friend, relax into this. You are stunningly good at what you do, stunningly good at communicating. And if you can teach an idiot like me, winner.
Absolutely. Gosh, couldn't have said it better. An idiot like him. I mean, goodness. But no, Richard, I echo John's thoughts completely. I love listening to you, and genuinely, I'm not just saying go and listen to all the other podcasts. I have not said that for all of the other Waves of the Magic Wand. I love that concept of building that picture in people's mind to understand thoroughly what is the cost of your action. And whatever it is, whether it's buying an old diesel car instead of a brand new electric car, what is the actual material cost to the world? I will take and we'll be talking about continually, because that is another gem from Richard Allan, from Professor Richard Allan, co-author of the IPCC report on climate change, a meteorologist that we would love to listen to, and you could tell me the weather anytime you like, because it's but I know it's much more important than that. But go on, John.
May I ask a final question? Richard, have you ever been called Dick?
No, only as an insult.
Tell us who it was, we'll go round and beat them up.
I suspect it might have been Liz.
Bless you,
Richard. She calls me Rich, but she does call me Richard when she's annoyed with me, usually.
Or Sunday night.
Worse.
You get the full name.
Worse things I can't repeat here, but anyway, you've both been incredibly. You're both always incredibly kind. So thanks for those words. And it's a real pleasure to come on here and talk about what I find fascinating, but also important. So thanks very much.
No, thank you.
And also, I should
definitely
say,
our pleasure.
Don't underplay what you're doing. I mean, you talked earlier. I'm just doing vans. I mean, what I'm doing is spread over, quite thinly in a way. But you're doing the nuts and bolts, tangible things. We need all these tangible things to come together. It's all of us collaborating and doing our bit. And we're a family with different skills. So I think that's the way it is, and that's the way we're doing well.
Paul and his tangible things.
Thank you, Richard. Me nuts and bolts.
Wondered where you were going with that.
No, just stop in there. Just stop in there. Absolutely. Because it's a family show, everybody.
Indeed.
Richard, again, thank you so much. And listen, everybody, do check this guy out. Follow him on X. You know, that thing. We'll put the link in the chat, so you can follow there. And Blue Sky. We'll find this. I have this new Blue Sky thing. I've not dabbled. Delved.
No, you were right the first time.
Rather than deviled into the Blue Sky world. But we shall do that, and we'll pop that link in there as well, so that you can educate yourself and be educated with very interesting posts from the lovely Professor Richard Allan. Thank you ever so much if you've been listening. We love having you along with us. Please do go and devour many other of the podcasts, which you can find on the EV Cafe takeaway, on Apple, on Spotify, or on our website, of course. Follow us on LinkedIn and check in with Richard on all of his various links. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day, everybody.